All right. So the topic for today, we're going to be talking about APIs, use effect. So it's day 6, APIs and use effect. We're going to talk about promises, fetch, Axios, and use effect. Okay. So promises are how we're going to have things that happen in our application that are asynchronous. Okay, so that's a big word. What does asynchronous mean?
Doing a lot of things at the same time.
Doing a lot of things at the same time, right? So we're going to be kind of multitasking, right? Really, asynchronous means that if we have a normal application where we say, JavaScript script, right, that's going to run from top to bottom, and normally JavaScript is going to execute the code one item at a time. Asynchronous code is things that are outside of the scope of our JavaScript file, right? So things that like calls to an API, right? Getting information from the internet. That's something that happens asynchronously. It doesn't happen within the flow of our application. It takes some amount of time. I mean, to us, it's imperceptible, right? It's a super fast blink of an eye. But in terms of our JavaScript application, it's something that happens outside of the normal flow of our application. Okay. So any sort of asynchronous code, there's a couple ways to deal with it. I think there's 3 that I know of. We can use callback functions, we can use promises, or we can use async await, which those are all basically built on top of callback functions. Yeah, thank you, Christian. Async means not happening at the same time by definition. So anytime we want something that takes some amount of time that's outside the flow of our normal JavaScript application, promises are sort of the conventional way of handling it. Okay, so let's take a look at, and by the way, this is a link to the promises documentation. So a promise is an object, right? Just a plain old JavaScript object that basically represents something that's going to happen in the future, right? So again, it's like a blink of an eye for us, but in terms of JavaScript, a promise is going to handle something that happens outside the flow or normal flow of our code, right? So if I say I'm going to go to the store and buy milk, right? There's there's really only 2 things, right? There's 2 possibilities. Either I'm going to come back with milk or you're never going to see me again, right? So either it's going to work out, I'm going to get the milk and come back, or, something's going to happen. I'm struck by lightning, abducted by aliens, right? Whatever, right? Most of the time, the things we want to do are going to happen, like going to the store and getting milk, right? But there's no guarantees in life, right? So if something doesn't work out, if what we're trying to do fails, right? We're trying to access a server that is down, or we're trying to read from a file that isn't there. We want to be able to handle those cases. And that's basically what a promise does. Okay, so it basically performs some sort of asynchronous operation and either says it made it or it didn't. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. Deep promise. Okay. So promises are basically can be in 3 states, right? So anytime we make a promise, I should say, anytime we create a promise object in JavaScript, it starts out pending, right? So when we make it, it's just pending by default. And then we perform some sort of operation, or the promise performs an operation, and it's either fulfilled or rejected, right? So fulfilled means everything worked out as it's supposed to. Rejected means it didn't work out, right? Something happened. So there was some error. So if we were to write our own promises, which we generally aren't going to, the promise is usually written for us and we're accessing it. But a promise basically is an object that takes a callback function as a parameter, right? So that callback function has two arguments, either resolve or reject. Resolve and reject are functions. If it works out, if we get the response we were expecting, we call the resolve function. If it doesn't work out and we didn't get what we expected, the promise then invokes the reject function. Okay. We handle promises with .then and .catch. Okay. So something we want to make some sort of asynchronous operation where once we invoke a function that's going to return a promise, we can then chain either .then or .catch. .then handles the successful operation. Okay, so if I call promise.then, it allows me to chain additional functionality that will then handle the successful operation. Okay, so the example they give on MDN is they create a promise, resolve, reject, and then they invoke the resolve function. So if it resolves, if it's successful, then we call .then. And then we can perform .then also returns a promise that, but inside of .then we can invoke other functions that work on the data from the promise. Okay, so any questions so far? Okay. The other alternative is .catch. .catch handles when things go wrong, right? So we got some sort of error, it didn't work out. We use the .catch to handle any sort of error messages, anything that doesn't work as expected. Okay. So let's, the promise demo, I think I took my code out. I hope I did. Yeah, cool. Okay. So I'm going to, oh, let me open the right folder here. So day 6, and close this. Demos, promise. Okay. So I'm going to make a promise, or my created promise object. So I'm going to say const. So I'm going to make two promises. I'm going to make a promise that resolves and a promise that rejects. Okay, so promise, let's say, yeah, promise, resolve. And to make a promise, I use the new keyword and make a promise object. Okay, promises take a callback function with two parameters. Either it resolves, let me spell out resolve, or it rejects. And arrow function. Okay, so if I want this to be a resolved promise, again, these are methods or functions. So I just, if it works, I'm going to call resolve. And then resolve just returns whatever data I'm getting back. So the data. Okay. And let's just console.log promise resolve. So if I call node promise.js, so the promise is basically it's an object with the data and it resolves, so it returns the data. So if I call promise resolve dot then, I get a promise back. Okay. So I know the promise is going to be fulfilled. So this promise is going to basically pass in the argument whatever it returns, right? So it's going to return the data. So if I want to look at the data, I would just say, give then another arrow function. I'll just call this, I don't know, data. And console.log data. Okay. So then I'm the outer console log, right? I'm console logging the promise, calling the then object on it. I get a promise back. And then the console log inside of .then, I'm actually able to access the data itself. Okay. How are we feeling about promises? Okay. If you're a little lost, you're normal. Somebody can teach this stuff. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. And share the results for transparency. You guys see them? I turned off my other computer. You guys see the results? Okay, cool. Okay, so if I want this to be a rejected promise, how would I make this a rejected promise? I would just call reject, right? I spelled it with an S, but I don't know. So now if I run then, let's see what I get. I get an error because I'm calling, I didn't rename this. Okay, so we get this warning, kinda, right? So if I have, I'm trying to call .then on a promise that's being rejected. So we don't want to call .then. What do we call if it's rejected? We still, yeah, we can still call .then, but we have to tack on a .catch. And then the catch will basically just handle the error. So I'll say ERR console.log ERR. Okay, so now we get because I'm rejecting with the data. So I wouldn't put the data in here. I would put some error message like something went wrong. Save this. Okay, so if the promise resolves, we can call .then and it'll give us the error that or I'm sorry, the data we were looking for, whatever the promise was for, right? If it errors, the .catch handles the error. Okay. So this is sort of esoteric, I think. We're not really going to be writing our own promises. So what I have here is a kind of an example of a real use of a promise. So I have a file here with just data in it, right? So I just have a bunch of recipes. And then inside of my promise, I'm trying to read the data from that file, right? So don't worry about the read file. This is just basically, I'm using the file system. I'm using Node.js's file property, and I'm reading from my operating system. I'm accessing the data.json, and I'm returning the data, right? So, or I'm reading from that file, and if there is data, I resolve it. If there is no data, then I reject it, right? So I have my promise .then, and I'm also handling for the error. So I have my promise.catch in the event that there's a problem. And then finally we'll run no matter what. So we don't the platform really doesn't talk about finally, but if we wanted to do something, whether it succeeded or failed, we could use the dot finally. Okay, so if I run this, node index.js. So I'm successfully reading from the file system. I'm reading from data.json, all the data that I have. So because everything was formatted properly, I was able to read the data from the file, right? So if something goes wrong, right, if I say delete the n here, so this file doesn't exist, right? So if I try to read from a file that doesn't exist, it's not going to work out. So if I run this now without the file, I get my error message. Okay, so this is a more realistic example, the way a promise would actually be used in practice. You're going to do some sort of asynchronous operation, and if it works, you're going to return resolved. If it rejects, you're going to return reject. Okay. Any questions about promises? And we're going to talk more about it if it's not crystal clear. We're going to show how they're actually used in practice. Okay, cool. Cool. Stop here.